All right, we're in John chapter 19, and we are right in the middle of the trials of Jesus. And so this is the last night, the next morning before he's crucified. And so we already had some pretty long chapters with Lamentations, so let's get through John kind of quickly here. It says, "Then Pilate had Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip." Terrible, terrible. I want to say tormenting, persecution, I don't know, can't grab the right word there, but just a terrible, terrible treatment of how they persecuted and scourged him. It says the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and they put it on his head, and they say that those thorns were maybe 3 to 6 inches long, and so they dug down into his flesh. They put it on his head and they put a purple robe on him. They said, "Hail, King of the Jews." They mocked him as they slapped him across the face. And Pilate went outside again and said to the people, "I'm going to bring him out to you now, but understand clearly that I find him not guilty." And then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And so, by the way, he had blood just dripping down his face and all down that beautiful robe that they put on to mock him. And Pilate said, "Look, here's the man." And when they saw him, the leading priests and temple guards began shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." Well, Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and crucify him." Pilate didn't want to crucify him. Pilate said, "I find him not guilty." The Jewish leaders replied, "By our law, he needs to die because he called himself the Son of God." Now, when Pilate heard this, he was more frightened than ever. So on one hand, he was frightened that if he didn't make the Jews happy, that Rome would come and punish him, for allowing an insurrection to happen. He was afraid on another side that, the Jews would just all revolt and they'd have war going on in the city. But now he was afraid that he might be about to get in trouble with God when he heard that Jesus called himself the Son of God. So when Pilate heard this, he was more frightened than ever. He took Jesus back into the headquarters again, and he asked him, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. And he said, "Why don't you talk to me?" Pilate demanded. "Don't you realize that I have the power to release you and I have the power to crucify you?" And then Jesus said, "You wouldn't have any power over me at all unless it were given to you from above. And so the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." And of course that was the Jewish people at that time, and Judas in particular, but also the chief priests and the Pharisees. It says, "Then Pilate tried to release him. But the Jewish leaders shouted, 'If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who declares himself a king is a rebel against Caesar.' And when they said this, Pilate brought Jesus out to them again. And then Pilate sat down on the judgment seat on the platform that's called the stone pavement, in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It was now about noon on the day of preparation for the Passover, and Pilate said to the people, 'Look, here's your king.' And they yelled, 'Away with him, crucify him.' 'What?' he said, 'Crucify your king?' Pilate asked, and they said, 'We have no king but Caesar.'" Man, they should have been saying, "God's our king," right? That's what they used to say. But they said, "We have no king but Caesar." They were just talking crazy because of their anger, their hatred for Jesus. And so the leading priest shouted, "We have no king but Caesar." Then Pilate turned over Jesus to them to be crucified, and so they took Jesus away. Carrying the cross by himself, he went to the place called the Place of the Skull. In Hebrew, that's called Golgotha. And there they nailed him to the cross. 2 others were crucified with him, one on either side, with Jesus between them. And Pilate posted a sign on the cross that read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." In other words, Pilate respected Jesus more than his own people did. The place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, Jerusalem, and the sign was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek so that many people could read it. Pilate was trying to make a point, wasn't he? Then the leading priests objected, and they said to Pilate, "Change it from 'the King of the Jews' to read, 'He said, I'm the King of the Jews.'" And Pilate replied, "No, what I've written, I've written." In other words, he's saying, "I'm sticking with it. He is the King of the Jews." Verse 23, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they divided his clothes among the 4 of them. They also took his robe, but it was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. And so they said, rather than tearing it apart, let's throw dice for it. And this fulfilled the prophecies in the scripture that say they divided my garments among themselves and threw dice for my clothing. Can you imagine how specific the prophets were when they foretold the death of Jesus Christ, even down to that detail that the soldiers would gamble over his clothing? And so this is what they did. They gambled for the clothes. Standing near the cross were Jesus' mother and his mother's sister, his mother's sister Mary, who was the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw his mother standing there beside the disciple he loved, and that's John. John was too humble to say that about himself. But when Jesus saw his mother standing there beside the disciple that Jesus loved, meaning John, Jesus said to Mary, "Dear woman, here's your son." And he said to this disciple, "Here's your mother." And from then on, this disciple took her into his home. I've always been touched by that. Here's Jesus, barely alive, barely breathing, beaten, from head to toe, bleeding, bruised, swollen, parched, just about to pass out with pain. And yet he ministers to his mother and tells this young man, please take care of her, and tells his mother, please take care of him. Verse 28, Jesus, and how much more does he love us, right? How does he take care of us today in all of our trials and our pains? Verse 28, Jesus knew that his mission was now fulfilled. And so to fulfill Scripture, he said, I'm thirsty. And a jar of sour wine was sitting there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put it on a long hyssop branch, and held it up to his lips. And when Jesus had tasted it, he said, it's finished. And then he bowed his head and released his spirit. It was a day of preparation, in other words, getting ready for the Passover. And the Jewish leaders didn't want the bodies hanging there the next day, which was the Sabbath, and a very special Sabbath because it was the Passover. And so they asked Pilate to hasten their deaths by ordering that their legs be broken, and then their bodies could be taken down off the cross. In other words, those when they were crucified and they were hanging there with all that weight on their hands, and their chest would sink in. It was so hard to breathe, and they would push up on their feet and get a big breath, and then they would breathe out and sink back down again. Well, if they broke their legs, they couldn't push back up again, and very shortly after that, they would just suffocate and they would die. And so the soldiers came and broke the legs of the two men crucified with Jesus, but when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, and so they didn't break his legs. One of the soldiers, however, pierced his side with a spear, and all of this is in the prophecies, that his side would be pierced, that they wouldn't break a bone, that he would be crucified with thieves. All of these are written in the prophets long before it happened. None of these things were in Jesus' control, but God saw them, and they all came together exactly as he foretold, showing that Jesus is the Messiah that was prophesied over and over that he would come. And so he pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water flowed out. And the physicians say that means that he literally died of a broken heart. There's a water sac around your heart, and that sac had broken already, and his heart was broken. At any rate, this report's from an eyewitness who gave an accurate account. He speaks the truth so that you can also believe. These things happen in fulfillment of the scriptures that say not one of his bones will be broken. And they'll look on the one they pierced. He's quoting the prophecies in the Old Testament. Afterward, Joseph of Arimathea, who'd been a secret disciple of Jesus. Well, I hope there's not too many secret disciples out there today, but maybe some people are afraid of persecution, and so they just keep it to themselves. But Joseph was a secret disciple of Jesus because he feared the Jewish leaders. But now he came and asked Pilate for permission to take down Jesus' body. And when Pilate gave permission, Joseph came and took the body away. With him came Nicodemus, the Pharisee, who came to Jesus at night. He brought about 75 pounds of perfumed ointment made from myrrh and aloes. Following Jewish burial custom, they wrapped Jesus' body with the spices in long sheets of linen cloth, and the place of crucifixion was near a garden, where there was a new tomb never used before. And so, because it was a day of preparation for the Jewish Passover, and since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. And so ends John chapter 19. I'm so glad you read with us, and I hope you'll hook up with us again tomorrow. God bless you.